Hello and welcome to What's Your Wrangle? I'm your host, Jennifer Shannon, and this season on the podcast, we're talking about the core components of digital transformation and helping to demystify some of these innovation framework tools. On today's episode, we're looking at cloud native architecture, what it is, how it works, and what are the benefits of leveraging this platform to accelerate your digital transformation. With me today are our two in-house experts, Ditmar and Suhanniyah Carpenter. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Nice to have you here. So I thought we would start a little bit with asking you a bit about your background and how you got to this role, and also what your role is in working with clients. Maybe, Suhanniyah, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So I'm a technical director here at Rangle, and every day seems to be a new adventure because we wear multiple different hats. But if I had to think about what we do in a general sense, I think there's about three different categories. One is client work. So I work with the delivery team, our account team, and our clients to make sure that the projects are successful and that we're getting it out the door. If there's any technical challenges that come up, we work through them so that we can unblock the team and we can move along. The second is we get to work on interesting internal initiatives that we work on. So that can be anything from new technical strategies that we want to pursue, learning and growth for the technology team, internal training and external training for our clients as well. The last but not least is I have developers and solution architects that I'm responsible for, and making sure that they're on exciting projects that they love and want to contribute to, and also helping them with their career growth as well.
Sounds like kind of a great job.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's a new adventure every day for sure.
Yeah, which is awesome, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
That's the best part about working in the tech field. Right?
Yeah.
Ditmar, how about you?
Yeah, absolutely. VP of Digital Innovation. I work with clients a lot now. Engineer by trade. I worked in plant floor doing robotics. So really technical field, and moving up the change and really helping our clients, because technology is very complex. However, there's always a way you can talk about technology in a way that you can understand it and plan to move forward. And that's the key to really succeeding in this marketplace. I think the technology field often has really complex terms. They really make things sound intimidating, but when you boil it down, there's simple paths forward. And that's why I like this role. I get to work with the clients, help them, plan their path forward. So.
It's funny because if someone asked me what your role was specifically, because I know you attend a lot of conferences, et cetera, is I would have said chief translator, right? So it is it's that translation from techies to sort of, how this is going to help me with my company. So are really two important roles in the company for sure. So the $1 million question, what is cloud native architecture? Right. What is it?
Yeah, cloud native is probably one of the most misunderstood terms in the industry. I think even the industry can't agree on cloud native. In some respects, it's easier to talk about what isn't cloud native because it narrows it down. So if you look at traditional architectures, you had bare metal in a server room. You had a team of people that kind of maintained those servers, administrated them, and then you had a production environment, a staging environment, and they were all separate and maintained, and your teams had to do a lot of work to maintain those. Now, the cloud came out quite a long time ago, so you're probably thinking cloud native, it's been around forever. Realistically, it hasn't. A lot of people have moved their workloads to the cloud, but simply moving what you have today to the cloud only unlocks a small potential, right? You're getting rid of your bare metal. You're reducing the administration costs, but you're not really unleashing the value you can get with a cloud native architecture. The key, I think, is the architecture of the system. It's using the value-added native services that the cloud providers provide, because they take care of the maintenance, they take care of the scaling, they take care of all that cost for us, rather than us having our own teams managing that. And it gets ever more increasingly difficult to manage that on your own because of scalability needs, because of the responsiveness and resilience you need in today's marketplace. You can't really afford to do that on your own. So the cloud native architecture is really the way of unpacking that and bringing that forward. I think the other big misunderstanding is people go, oh man, I've got all this infrastructure, I've got all these teams. How do you get started in something like this? It's intimidating. You start small. You can literally start really, really small, right? And continue to work with your existing systems, your monolith, your big systems like SAP Hybris, Adobe AEM. So in a nutshell, it's a way of architecting new systems. So when we talk about cloud native, it's about starting small. It's about full stack cross-functional teams, which is something we do here all the time. However, you're starting to have the blend of the architecture in that team. Right? Because now the infrastructure that used to be provisioned by people has an API. It can be provisioned by a cross-functional team of developers, data analysts, scrum masters, and product managers. They are now empowered to build their own architecture. And that gives you unbelievable scalability and response time. Because when a team is responsible from beginning to end, they can accomplish incredible things. It also gets you out of that big, we've got one giant thing, we deploy that one giant thing.
Right.
You've got that sliver, you can deploy that on your own. And we can actually talk about the complexities of managing that, because it brings new paradigms to the table. You get huge advantages, but there's other things you have to consider.
Right. What's your elevator pitch for what's cloud native architecture?
So, I mean, cloud native architecture is really thinking about the cloud from the ground up. So it's not an afterthought. It's leveraging, like Ditmar mentioned, the infrastructure and the services, the APIs and the products that are available to you to build out something on the cloud. And it really stems from like microservice architecture patterns, because before, we were building out monolithic applications. It was all centralized. With microservices, you're decentralized. You're building out distributed systems. And the cloud is absolutely the perfect fit for that, because the cloud in itself is decentralized and distributed. And it really helps you build out those proper, it has everything for you that you can have, like messaging queues, event-driven architecture. Everything is there for you, so you don't have to build out those things or buy new hardware and install like RabbitMQ or anything like that. Everything's there for you, and you're just focusing on the business problem that you're trying to solve.
And what I'm hearing here is speed.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Speed.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, and we're talking about a digital transformation and innovation speed, right?
Yeah.
The ability
Yeah.
to change, pivot, adapt, right?
Yeah, I think sometimes talking through an example solidifies the differences very powerfully. So if we take a traditional e-commerce system that was built on maybe legacy technologies, if you want to run a performance test to prepare for Black Friday, that is a very big organizational task. You have to decide, are you going to run it in production, or are you going to run it in staging? Well, production matches production. Staging probably doesn't in a legacy environment. So you have to get the organization to make a big decision. Where are you going to run it? If it's staging, it's not going to be accurate. So if you go for production, you have to run it after hours, right?
Right.
To make sure that it doesn't impact current customers. You have to organize your teams to go in at night and perform that load test. And then you don't have high confidence, because you really don't want to bring production to its knees. So you only push performance limits to a certain extent. If you contrast that to cloud native, if you've done everything with the key architectures, you can now provision your own instance of production, 100% immutable copy of production for just the load test.
Right.
Then you can perform that load test, scale it up. It's elastic, so that
Right.
it will already extend and expand to meet that demand. It's cost effective. You provision it for that one use, and then you deprovision it. You dispose of the architecture. You only pay for what you use, and you have high confidence when you're done. Now the trick is, people think, okay, well, that's a good benefit. It compounds, right?
Right.
So let's say 2 weeks before Black Friday, there's been a lot of code changes. In the legacy environment, do you want to run that expensive test so close to Black Friday? You've probably locked down the environment. With the other one, provision it, run them through the tests with all the changes, pass, we're confident, we're ready to go for Black Friday. So these things have a scaling effect. The more you do them, the more you realize the power that you get.
Right, yeah. And there's a reason it's called Black Friday, right? I mean, no one's going to take the risk at that time, right? That's for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that there is a real sort of group of people that are sitting out there saying to themselves, okay, they have this substantial sort of technology platform, technical debt, and they're thinking to themselves, this sounds great. I would love to be more nimble and more agile. Well, where do you start? How do you move towards cloud native? How do you choose a vendor? How do you start having that discussion internally?
Yeah, I think that the key is to look at the system you have and say, what's preventing us today from moving forward? What is that really big pain point where we're always like, I wish we could do that?
Right.
That starts to identify, okay, what do we need to move to a new architecture? So you keep your system in place and you pull that one thread out and you start to build that on a nimble cloud architecture.
Right.
And now how do you deal with that? You've got your existing systems, various systems that are running your business today, and you're pulling out that thread. You can build an anti-corruption layer between the two, and they just look like two different endpoints to themselves. So now you can suddenly start to build that functionality in the cloud native environment, and you can start to move fast on that important need and slowly move more elements out. Martin Fowler came up with the strangler pattern, which is just exactly that. It's named after an Australian vine that kind of strangles the tree that it's growing from, right?
Great name.
it's never an all or none. You start small. You start to
Right.
bring pieces out, and slowly but surely the monolith or legacy systems become less important, and your new architecture kind of takes over. So that's the easiest way to start.
Yeah.
It also involves a change to how you operate your teams, right? So
interesting.
with the monolithic application development that we're traditionally used to, teams are working in silos, right? There's each of the feature teams that are working together, they're developing their feature, then it bubbles up to a QA team that's testing the entire application, because you couldn't just release one module in the old framework of things, right? So which was a con for any sort of new ideation, right? Like if you have a new feature that you're trying to get out, you can't just get that out in time, because just that one module change will mean that we have to test our entire module set, an entire QA testing that needs to happen. And if you're running a major or a large scale enterprise software company and you have clients that are deploying on premise, they're not going to be as willing to take in that new feature, because that means at an enterprise level, they need to retest everything, right? So it really needs to start with the shift in how you're designing your cross-functional teams around your domain-driven design principles of a domain team takes a microservice, they're autonomous, they have that service, and they can go from code to deployment all on their own.
And one could argue in that, and I love the way that you've said that about the teams, one could argue that that actually creates a really great environment of try, test, learn, don't be afraid, get something out there.
Absolutely.
Talk to me about how, and just if you want to expand for me a little bit about how teams are leveraging this to do exactly that.
Yeah, and I mean, when the teams are empowered and they own an entire microservice or service on the cloud, they can manage the entire service and how it's developed, how it's deployed. They can utilize the right technology, so they're not just working off of one technology stack. If there is a technology stack that's meant for front-end development, they can leverage that. If it's just a single-thread application, they can leverage Node. So they don't have to use heavy back-end technology, for example, across the board. Each solution has the technology that works best for it, and they're working on that stack in itself, and they can take it from I'm coding this new feature, and now I'm deploying it out. I can test it, I can do A/B testing, I can deploy in like smaller increments, right? And you're not having to kind of get feedback from or approval from other product owners that are working on the other domains to say, yes, you can make this change, because you have that bounded context that you're working within.
And the dependencies aren't as urgent.
Yeah, and you're breaking down that dependency, so they're now interdependent.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm certainly going to date myself here, but I do remember the days where it was like, okay, a release is happening this Saturday night, 2:00 in the morning, and everyone's like, fingers crossed, everybody's got their Blackberries on, right?
Yeah.
But that's not the case anymore.
Yeah, and that leads to a lot of tension, because if my module was not touched and I didn't have any feature changes, I still have to be on call and on support. Right? And this kind of alleviates that, and it's just the team that worked on the particular element.
And on top of that, there's a few technical pieces that really help too. You can do a canary deploy, or you can use feature flags, so you can really decouple deployment. I've pushed this live and release. That's a separate step. We can test it internally, right? Verify that it's working. So it's not that, oh my God, I'm worried about this. We can incrementally test ourselves first, have confidence. Our QA team's like, yes, we're good to go. Release a little bit of traffic to it, and then so forth. So you've got so much more flexibility with this type of architecture that we didn't have in the past, because if you deployed a big package of code, all of that had to be tested and working. Yeah.
And I love that idea of being able to just put a little something out there, and rather than test it in staging and have a bunch of developers or marketing folks dig in and see if you can find the bugs, you're like, hey, people who will actually consume this, could you do that for us? Right? I mean, just makes them more sense, right?
And you can test your ideas faster, right? Because in the older kind of sense, you have 3 months to develop your feature, and then you're getting feedback from your actual users. Here, you can get it in like a couple of weeks. As soon as your development is done, you can get feedback and revise and be agile and respond to the changes faster, rather than waiting for a release cycle so that you can actually deploy it and test it.
And given the really rapid evolution of technology, like I'm guessing 6 months from now, things will be even so much different than today. You absolutely need this kind of nimble elasticity in your business, right?
It's vital.
Yeah, for sure. So the thought running through my head as someone who has leveraged third-party vendors forever and ever and ever is, okay, yes, we're going to build all these things that are cloud native, and is it, what happens if we want to change vendors, or not happy, or it's not servicing us the way that we wanted to do? What then? What happens? Are we locked in?
That's a great topic. I mean, that's probably the biggest concern in the industry. And I think it really depends on the business and the size of the business you have and the problem you're solving. There are models you can follow that kind of resolve this issue. So you have polyglot cloud. So that's a mature cloud native architecture where you maybe have a primary vendor, like maybe Amazon is your primary vendor or GCP, but you can bring in other cloud native services from another vendor, like Azure. So the way that works is you start to provision the best of the breed, best of the native services, and they communicate as a separate bounded context to each other. You don't need everything in one cloud. You get efficiencies because it all works together, all the persistence, the scaling to multiple availability zones. However, you can harness multiple cloud vendors together. The other aspect is ultimately when you're building software solutions, you are binding into something, right? And it's always a cost-benefit analysis. The power and the speed you get by bringing these native services together are just incredible. Even if you look at, let's say we're going to pick Amazon, you look at their product page, and now if you compare a open source solution versus the Amazon equivalent, if you run with the open source, your team is responsible for managing it, for scaling it, for dealing with security, all these really difficult concerns. Whereas when you go with the cloud native, they work together, they scale together, they go across availability zones. So the question about lock-in is really, it depends. If you're a gigantic $50 billion bank, well, yeah, then it's a big concern. You probably want to spread that workload across multiple clouds. If you're a small startup, that is the last of your concerns. Get the benefit and run. If you're in between, you have a conversation, and it's the business drivers that ultimately determine that.
Right. And one could argue that because the cloud services are in and of themselves so customer centric, right? So they have all of this data that they're getting on the things that we need to be able to forward our our digital infrastructure, that they are making changes constantly, that if we owned that, we wouldn't necessarily be on the cutting edge because we would be maintaining.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So now I've got my cloud native platform, but I've also got Salesforce or Adobe or GA or, the 10,000 list of vendors that I'm also using. What happens with that integration? Are these systems built to integrate regardless of who the vendor ownership is?
Great question. Those systems will be around for a long time. They all have APIs. They're all open. If you look at Adobe AM, it's now a headless CMS, meaning they've decoupled the presentation, which is what single-page apps did a long time ago for the front end. So they're trying to catch up. I think the tricky part is, I think you use those services for the value that they provide, and you integrate them on a cloud-native platform. The reason being is data is really the commerce of a digital experience. Your data is the gold. So if it's in a proprietary box, you can pull it out through APIs, but you have very little insight over how you manage it or how you deal with it. Once you pull it out into cloud native, you put it into a data lake, you have an immutable store of that record to perpetuity. So that gives you ability to do data analysis, machine learning, all sorts of great things. So work with those providers, work with those solutions, integrate around them, and pull the data out and centralize that, and then build around it. And I think in time you'll be able to make that decision. Do you stick with that? Because you have proprietary versus open source on top of it. So to get development resources to work on a proprietary solution versus an open source solution, you have a huge developer pool sharing knowledge around the globe moving this forward versus the one where you're spending for a contractor that knows that domain. So there's a lot to that. It's a very difficult question. I think it depends a lot on your business and where you're going. But if you want to be digital first, I would start to move some of that data outside so you can use it for everything else, machine learning and so forth. So I think those are some of the keys.
All the more reason to call in an expert, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the pain points, Suhanniyah, that you're seeing that this is solving for customers? They're coming to you with, this is my plan, and I know that I have to be digital first, and I need a different strategy. What are some of the pain points that you're seeing are being solved by cloud native?
Definitely, it's leveraging all of the existing infrastructure that's there, right? So when you're a small startup, it's hard for you to acquire all this hardware to run all of this infrastructure. It's hard for you to set up everything that needs to be in place just so you can start building, right? So here, you're not worrying about the infrastructure. There's auto provisioning, auto scaling, auto redundancy, everything that needs to be there for you to just run your application. So this takes away that element of it, and then it just solves your business problem. So now I can think about, how do I build what I need to build? What services do I need? So you can leverage everything that's out there, such as your message queues, your event-driven architecture patterns with serverless patterns that are out there that we didn't really touch on, like functions as a service. AWS Lambda is commonly known for that, where you're running server-side computational logic in an event-driven kind of architecture where it's kind of a stateless container that's running your code, but it doesn't need to be running all the time. You just spin it up as you need it. So you're also saving on computational kind of like hardware at a time that needs to be there to constantly run your application. That's not there anymore. Just spins up when you need it. It does the work for you, gives you your output, and you move along. So there's a lot out there that you can leverage to solve your problem, but what's key is knowing where it falls short, right? So whenever you have something like this, where it's a distributed architecture, latency and eventual consistency are key players in that. So knowing where your your solution falls short is important to how you design your architecture, right? So knowing your use cases up front, does my use case allow me to have this latency? Is it okay for me to process this data behind the scenes, or does the user need feedback right away, right? So knowing all these things up front will let you know which services are actually available for you and which ones you kind of have to pass on.
So you're spending runway on getting the word out and spreading the word and getting adoption as opposed to developing the technology, right? Which is pretty interesting.
And it gives you the power to use the technology that you need, right? So you're not bounded to what the company has been using for ages and ages, right? If you think that Node is the way to go, then you're free to do that. So it gives the teams the ability to use what they're comfortable with, right? And you can use the right tool for the right job, because sometimes you're always kind of shoehorning the solution, right? Because that's all that you have and that's all that's supported. That's all that we can support. But now that's not the case.
Right, because I've often been in the case where you're doing custom builds on top of a vendor solution that you have, because they can't meet all of your needs.
Absolutely.
But the nimble and elasticity that this presents is like, well, here's what we need. It's either out there or I guarantee you they'll build it real quick.
Absolutely,
right? So this is a space that is evolving ridiculously fast. What's going to happen in this space in the next, let's say 8 months to a year? What do you think is going to happen that's going to even further enable people to move faster?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's really shifting the architectural kind of mindset of everyone that's kind of using cloud native architecture, right? Because the old way of developing was, building that monolith, and then we got into microservices, and then we got into containers, and then we got into cloud native architecture. Now we're getting more and more throughput on serverless, right? Everyone's leveraging these functions as a service, AWS Lambdas, to run their piece of code. And so we're seeing that it's getting more and more distributed, that we're finding ways to improve on our distributed architecture models, right? So we know that we need to have domain-driven design. We need to split it up. But how we're splitting that up is getting more and more refined, where we're focusing on events now. And how do we make events better? Before it was just, okay, we know we need events, so we have this piece of code that works on events. We know we need a queue, this piece of code. But now we're refining each and every one of them and says, okay, if this is your use case, then you need to use X. And if this is your use case, you need to use Y. It's getting more refined, and I feel like we're just going to get more and more efficiency out of this. But we're also going to understand that there might be drawbacks to it. And I think we need to be very careful with like the new shiny technology that's out there. Understanding its drawbacks and architecting that into our solution is going to be very important.
What do those drawbacks look like?
So we touched on things like latencies and eventual consistency as one thing, right? So those are the kind of things where it really impacts your data. It impacts your user's experience, because if you're not factoring that in, that's essentially breaking down all of your use cases, right? So if you've gone ahead and developed on this premise that I have this new shiny thing that takes care of my computational logic, but it takes, a couple milliseconds to spin up before I run my, couple millisecond computational logic, that's just going to be a compounding effect.
Yeah, I think there's keys in the architecture. Yeah. If you make mistakes, they can be costly. They can cost up large service charges by the cloud vendors. Right. But back to that original question, I was thinking about it, and I think fundamentally, companies are faced with a decision right now. Do we keep investing in the platforms we have today, or do we start to move into this new direction? I think, like, if you look back, let's talk about bare metal server rooms. If you had those today, that's probably a really bad thing, because to keep up with the industry when you're maintaining services, patching and taking care of security and all the things, you're going to be running way behind the competition.
Not
So I
to
think
mention
there's
the air conditioning bill.
not to, the air conditioning, and even finding the resources to manage that is going to
Right.
get more increasingly difficult. So you don't want your business to get handicapped by old ways of doing things. So fundamentally, I agree with Suhanniyah that it is new and shiny. There will be difficulties in the road, but you're much better starting now, because I think the key is the start. Some businesses, like I said, they look at it and go, too much, too hard, we don't have the team, let's not start.
Right.
That means you're investing in your current platform for maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 years.
Right.
If your competition has slowly started to pull the threads out and started to move to the modern architecture, they will be able to move so much faster. And now you're facing a really difficult question. Do we have to do it all in one chunk, which is a really daunting task and typically fails and has cost overruns? You need to start small, so you need to start early and start experimenting with the technology. Find out what works for your company. Find a partner that can do this work for you and kind of train your staff up. There's ways to get started. I think delaying the start is going to be the critical path in your business. So I think fundamentally, even though there's a lot of technical depth here, it comes down to business decisions and making them at the right time. Earlier on, maybe it wasn't mature enough. It's hitting that maturity level that now is the right time to get into it. So I think that's the key for this space.
And what was once deemed, a positive in the space, that, wow, look at this, the server that we have, and we have this incredible team, whatever, is now sort of shifting down the curve to be sort of like a debt. And if you think about the disruptors in the space, if they don't have that barrier to entry, the having to skill up or have that team internally, they're going to be moving quick, boy.
Like you said, reducing that technical debt is everything, right? The more software, the more infrastructure, the more deployment, the more configuration that your team is responsible for managing, the slower they're going to move. The more they can concentrate on building software solutions, the better off they are. And software is spreading into every discipline. It's spreading into creative. It's spreading into the DevOps movement, where your whole deployment pipeline is software. And now it's your infrastructure as code. Software is managing that. It's just an API to the infrastructure, so we can program it and provision it as we need. So software keeps spreading, and that's why you need to get onto this trend, because you can move so much quicker than when it's manually done. The other aspect that we don't really talk about is when you've provisioned it and it's all in source control, it's all, the company owns all the assets. It's not in people's heads. It's all written down. It's all versioned. You can roll back. You can roll back.
Yeah.
But you can commit new versions. But that gives your company the ability to move forward. People lose resources all the time. That knowledge doesn't just disappear. It's all in the source code itself, right? So there's big impacts. Like when you look at these decisions, that's why I said it's about starting. You have to weigh all this as an organization to say, does it make sense? And we're thinking at this point is a very good time to make that shift.
Not only does it make sense, there's a sense for urgency. Big
Urgency,
time,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
This is an exciting time.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an exciting job to be in, right, guys?
Absolutely.
It is.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for listening to What's Your Wrangle today. We hope that you found some moments that made you think or taught you something or even sparked a conversation with your company. Follow us on iTunes or Spotify to get notifications for all future episodes. You can now watch our podcast on YouTube, so be sure to like and subscribe. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what we discuss each week and hear your point of view on the topics. So be sure to let us know what your wrangle is by using the hashtag AskWrangle on Twitter or emailing us at podcast@Rangle.io. Thanks so much for joining us and have a great day.